June 4th, 1944, 21:30 hours. Southwick House, Hampshire, England. Rain needles the darkness outside Southwick House, tapping against the tall windows with a persistence that feels almost deliberate. It does not fall in violent sheets, but in a steady, eroding rhythm, the kind that wears down certainty minute by minute. The lawns beyond the glass are waterlogged, the gravel paths slick beneath the boots of sentries who pace without speaking. Inside, the Allied headquarters feels smaller than it should. The operations room is lit by shaded lamps that cast hard pools of light across maps and charts. Everything beyond those circles dissolves into shadow. Cigarette smoke hangs low, trapped beneath the ceiling. Coffee sits untouched in chipped mugs, long since cold. At the center of the room, a wall-sized map of northern France dominates the space. Normandy, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword. The names are written neatly in chalk, precise and ordered, as if clarity on the wall might impose order on what waits beyond the channel. Around the long table stand the men who must decide whether the invasion proceeds or waits. Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay studies the naval charts, finger tracing forecasted swell lines with quiet intensity. Air Chief Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory keeps his gaze fixed downward, fingers pressed together, knowing how little air power can do when cloud ceilings refuse to lift. General Bernard Montgomery is absent, already forward with his staff, preparing to move once the order comes, or does not. Standing slightly apart from the table is Winston Churchill. He is not in uniform. He never is. A dark suit hangs heavily from his shoulders, bow tie loosened, cane resting against the table leg. His cigar remains unlit, held more from habit than desire. He shifts his weight carefully, listening not only to what is said, but to what is no longer being asked. This is not the War Cabinet. This is not a room where authority is exercised by speech alone. At the far end of the table stands General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander. His jacket is buttoned, his tie straight, posture unyielding but restrained. He does not pace. He does not interrupt. He listens. James Stagg, the chief meteorologist, clears his throat. The sound cuts sharply through the room. Conditions are deteriorating, he says carefully. High winds in the channel. Low cloud ceilings over Normandy. Airborne operations would be scattered. No one responds at once. There may be a brief improvement, Stagg continues. Late on the 5th, possibly into the early hours of the 6th. But it will be narrow and unstable. Unstable. The word settles heavily. Churchill has lived with worse forecasts. In 1940, the reports had promised invasion, collapse, extinction. Then, his voice had mattered. He had spoken, and Britain had moved. This moment feels different. Eisenhower steps closer to the table and rests both hands on the back of a chair. The wood creaks softly under his grip. If we delay, he says, evenly, we risk losing the element of surprise. The enemy will not remain blind. Ramsay inclines his head. Leigh-Mallory does not. Our aircraft will be flying with severe limitations, the Air Marshal replies. Paratroopers could be scattered far from their objectives. Churchill listens in silence, eyes fixed on the map. He knows every argument. They have been made, remade, exhausted. Nothing new will emerge from repetition. He leans forward, placing both hands on the table. The consequences of failure, he says quietly, would be beyond calculation. We must be certain. Eisenhower meets his gaze. There are no certainties left, he replies. Only chances. The exchange is brief, polite, controlled. Churchill says nothing for a moment longer than usual. In that silence, something settles with unmistakable clarity. This is not a failure of leadership, but the limit of it. The point beyond which authority, even his, cannot travel. He can advise. He can warn. He can articulate the risks. But the authority to act does not belong to him. Operation Overlord has passed beyond politics. It is no longer a question of resolve or rhetoric. It is an industrial operation now. Ships, fuel, logistics, and men on a scale Britain could never sustain alone. Along the southern coast, American columns are already in motion. Engines idle. Landing craft are loaded and checked again. Momentum is building. And momentum does not wait for consent. Churchill straightens slowly. He does not press the argument further. He steps back not because he is overruled, but because the war now demands it. Outside, the rain continues its steady assault. And across the channel, unseen and indifferent, the beaches of Normandy wait. June 1944. The most important decision of the war was not made on the beaches of Normandy. It was made on a wet English night, when Britain realized victory would no longer be directed from London. This is the story of the night Churchill was forced to step aside, and how that moment quietly reshaped the war. June 5, 1944. Shortly after midnight. Southwick House, Hampshire. The rain does not stop. It loosens its grip for a moment, then returns with renewed insistence, drumming against the windows as if testing their resolve. Outside, the wind claws through the trees lining the estate, bending branches low and dragging cloud across the channel in slow, stubborn layers. Somewhere beyond the darkness, the invasion fleet waits. Engines warm, crews alert, men packed tightly into steel hulls that smell of oil and unease. Inside Southwick House, the night stretches without relief. No one has slept. The operations room carries the marks of prolonged strain. Chalk lines on the maps have been erased and redrawn so many times that the board beneath shows through. Pencils lie scattered, their points dulled by constant use. Coffee cups remain untouched, abandoned hours earlier when caffeine ceased to matter. Every minute now closes another door. Eisenhower stands once more before the map of Normandy. Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword. Names that will soon cease to be abstractions. Behind him, Churchill has taken a seat. He sits heavily, cane resting across his knee, hands folded loosely in front of him. His posture is composed, but his eyes move restlessly between the map, the men around the table, and the clock mounted above the doorway. Time, now, is no longer neutral. James Stagg re-enters the room with updated charts. He looks more tired than before, his voice lower, his movements careful. The window holds, he says. Briefly. Seas will remain rough. Winds marginal. Cloud cover, imperfect. He pauses. But acceptable. The word lingers. Acceptable is not reassuring. It is merely sufficient. The language of necessity rather than confidence. Lee Mallory shifts his weight. Ramsey exhales slowly, almost imperceptibly. No one speaks. No one in the room believes the decision, whichever way it falls, will spare them responsibility. Eisenhower turns from the map. I am convinced, he says, evenly, that we must go. The room seems to draw inward. Churchill closes his eyes briefly. Gallipoli surfaces unbidden, the boats grinding against hostile shores, the confusion, the absence of control once events outran intention. It has never left him. Every major decision since has been shaped by that memory, whether acknowledged or not. He opens his eyes again. This time, restraint is not caution. It is duty. I wish you good luck, Churchill says. The words are formal, almost understated. Yet in this room, at this hour, they carry weight. Eisenhower nods once. Thank you, sir. There is no ceremony beyond that. No handshake. No attempt at reassurance. The decision moves outward immediately. Telephones begin to ring. Radios crackle to life. Aides step briskly into corridors, voices low but urgent. Along the southern coast, engines are started. Orders are repeated, confirmed, acted upon. The war has crossed the line between intention and execution. Churchill stands. He does not offer advice. He does not ask to review the final wording. He understands that this moment cannot be amended without consequence. As he walks toward the exit, the realization settles fully, not as shock, but as certainty. Once the invasion begins, control will not return. Events will outpace messages. Decisions will be made by officers waist-deep in water, not by leaders in dry rooms. Momentum, once released, will not ask permission again. Outside, the first pale suggestion of dawn presses against the clouds. The wind has not eased, but it has steadied, as if settling into its own grim routine. Churchill pauses at the top of the steps. He looks east, toward a horizon still hidden. Most of the men now moving toward France are not British. Their numbers, their equipment, their replacements will determine the pace of what follows. Britain will still matter, profoundly, but it will no longer decide alone. This is not humiliation. It is transition. As his car pulls away from Southwick House, tires hissing softly on wet gravel, Churchill sits in silence. No phrases form in his mind. No speeches. Only the knowledge that history, once guided by his words, is now moving ahead of him. Across the channel, the invasion fleet pushes into uncertain seas. Steel hulls rise and fall in the darkness. Men grip rifles, stare at nothing, or whisper quiet prayers they have never spoken aloud before. And somewhere between the shore they are leaving and the shore they have yet to reach, the decision made in this room begins to take effect, steadily, irrevocably. The next chapter explores what that decision cost Britain after D-Day. June 6, 1944. Shortly before dawn. Whitehall, London. The first light reaches London reluctantly. Low cloud presses against the skyline, muting color and sound alike. The city wakes as it has for years now, quietly, deliberately. Buses rolling through streets still marked by scars of earlier nights. Shop shutters lifting in measured rhythm. Wardens finishing their rounds with practiced indifference. Inside the cabinet war rooms, time moves differently. The air is cool, regulated, almost antiseptic. Lamps cast controlled pools of light over long tables where maps have already been annotated and re-annotated, pencil marks layered upon one another with careful restraint. Clerks move softly, lowering their voices instinctively, as though the walls themselves might be listening. Winston Churchill stands alone at the central table. He has been there for some time. The map of northern France lies open before him, familiar now to the point of intimacy. Beachheads marked, timetables penciled in, arrows indicating advances that have not yet occurred and may yet fail. For the first time since the war began, he is not shaping events. He is tracking them. The distinction settles quickly and heavily. A signal officer approaches, stops at a respectful distance, and places a dispatch on the table. Churchill reads it once. No embellishment. No color. Just facts stripped to their barest form. Landings underway. Resistance uneven. Airborne units scattered. Casualties undetermined. He folds the paper neatly and sets it aside. There is no outward reaction. What Churchill feels is not fear, nor surprise, but recognition. The war has crossed a threshold. It is no longer responsive to persuasion or personality. It is governed now by something colder: scale, momentum, inevitability. Momentum has become the commanding force. And momentum answers to no one. Lieutenant Colonel Ian Jacob enters the room, his steps measured. "They're ashore," he says quietly. Churchill nods. "And command?" "Eisenhower's," Jacob replies. Unquestioned. There is no pause this time. No weighing of words. No instinctive reach for qualification. Churchill already knows. He walks slowly to the far end of the room, where a globe rests beneath a shaded lamp. His fingers trace the outline of Europe, from the Channel coast inward, toward names that have lived on maps for years and will now become landscapes of loss. Once, British strategy had defined the rhythm of the war. Peripheral campaigns, deliberate pressure, time bought through caution. That rhythm is gone. Across the Channel, formations are landing in numbers Britain could never have sustained alone. Supply chains already extend beyond England, across an ocean, backed by an economy that does not tire, does not ration hope. Churchill understands what this means, not only for Normandy, but for the shape of power that will follow victory. Another note arrives, this one routed through diplomatic channels from Washington. The language is careful, cooperative, respectful of Allied unity. But beneath it lies a simple truth. Operational authority now resides where mass resides. Churchill drafts a reply himself. He chooses his words with precision. There is no appeal to past sacrifice. No reminder of Britain's early stand when the outcome was uncertain and allies were few. Instead, the message speaks of unity, of confidence, of support for the supreme commander. It is not submission, but it is concession. By mid-morning, Churchill prepares to address the House of Commons. Outside, London continues to function. Queues form. Papers are sold. Damage is patched just enough to endure another day. Inside the chamber, his voice carries assurance. "This is the beginning of the liberation of Europe," he declares. "The hour we have prepared for has struck." Applause follows immediately. The public hears resolve. What they do not hear, what cannot be said, is that Britain's role has changed irreversibly. That from this day forward, influence will replace authorship. Elsewhere, the press begins to shift its focus. Reports from the front emphasize coordination, scale, continuity. The language of command is technical now, operational rather than political. Names appear attached to movements, not speeches. Churchill reads a clipping later that afternoon. He reads it twice. Then he places it face down on the table. Silence stretches longer than usual. He is already thinking beyond Normandy, beyond hedgerows and beachheads, to conferences not yet scheduled, to rooms not yet chosen, to tables where Britain will sit respected and heard, but no longer decisive. This is the price of victory. That evening, confirmation arrives. Despite heavy fighting, the beachheads hold. The invasion has not failed. Churchill allows himself a breath, not of triumph, but of relief. The alliance has endured its most dangerous test. But endurance has come with a cost that cannot be recovered. The war is being won, and Britain is no longer steering it. Across the Channel, the fighting continues. The machinery of liberation grinds forward, indifferent to who once held the pen. And Winston Churchill, who once shaped history with words alone, now watches as history moves on, without waiting for him to speak. Summer 1944. London, Washington, and the Western Front. The war does not pause to acknowledge the change. In Normandy, the fighting spreads outward from the beaches into hedgerows, villages, and fields that resist surrender 1 meter at a time. The soundscape of the campaign is no longer waves and engines, but artillery, shouted orders, and the constant metallic tearing of earth under fire. Reports continue to arrive in London, some hopeful, some grim, but always filtered through chains of command that no longer originate there. Churchill reads everyone. He reads not simply for what they report, but for what they confirm. To do so would risk something far more dangerous than diminished influence, a fracture in the alliance while the war is still being fought. So Churchill adjusts. He leans into what Britain still does better than any other power: diplomacy, continuity, legitimacy. He positions Britain as a bridge between experience and scale, between the old world and the new, between memory and momentum. It is a role of influence, not command, but it remains a role of consequence. Privately, he confides to a close advisor that the war has resolved a question Britain could no longer postpone. "We have won," he says quietly, "but we have also been overtaken." There is no bitterness in his voice, only clarity. As Allied armies push toward the German border, operational decisions increasingly bypass London altogether. Headquarters on the continent becomes the unquestioned hub of Western command. British generals continue to advise, to plan, and to fight with distinction, but the tempo is set elsewhere. This is not humiliation. It is transition. Churchill understands that history will not judge Britain by how loudly it insisted on control, but by how wisely it navigated its loss. By the autumn of 1944, attention begins to shift toward the peace. Conferences are planned. Seats are assigned. Agendas drafted. Churchill prepares meticulously. He knows that influence in the post-war world will depend less on issuing orders than on shaping the system that replaces war itself. Collective security, economic reconstruction, international legitimacy. These are not British inventions, but Britain can help anchor them. That, now, is the task. As winter approaches, Churchill reflects often on the arc of the conflict. From isolation to alliance. From leadership to partnership. From authorship to stewardship. It is not the ending he once imagined, but it is an ending that preserves what matters most: stability, cooperation, and the avoidance of another catastrophe. On quiet evenings, he dictates notes for speeches not yet delivered. Not declarations of dominance, but warnings against division, against pride, against the illusion that power, once earned, remains fixed forever. The war has taught him otherwise. Victory will come, and when it does, the world will already be different, not because Britain failed, but because modern war demands a different balance of power, one built not on tradition, but on capacity. Churchill does not resist this truth. He prepares Britain to live within it. And in doing so, he ensures that while the pen may have passed to other hands, Britain's voice will remain measured, experienced, and essential in shaping the peace that follows. Winter 1944 to 1945. Europe and the conference tables beyond it. The war acquires a double rhythm. At the front, it is immediate and unforgiving. Mud replaces grass. Snow replaces dust. Men advance through forests, rivers, and ruined towns whose names will soon stand for endurance rather than geography. Orders are urgent. Casualties are counted daily. Progress is measured in bridges secured and roads reopened under fire. But far from the guns, another contest unfolds, quieter, slower, and no less decisive. In London, Churchill's days are increasingly filled not with operational briefings, but with memoranda about borders, currencies, and institutions that do not yet exist. His evenings are spent reading drafts that speak in the language of permanence rather than maneuver. He understands that the shape of victory will matter as much as victory itself. Across the Channel, the Allied command structure has settled into its final form. Eisenhower's authority is complete and uncontested. His style, restrained, methodical, coalition-minded, has proven suited to a war fought by many nations but driven by overwhelming capacity. British officers remain everywhere. They plan, they advise, they fight with distinction. But no one now doubts where decisions originate. Hierarchy has been clarified without announcement. Churchill does not challenge this. He focuses instead on the future that will follow Germany's collapse. When the Allied leaders gather at Yalta, the imbalance is unmistakable. Roosevelt arrives backed by industrial power without precedent, Stalin by territorial momentum and hard-earned leverage. Churchill arrives carrying history, experience, and moral authority, powerful currencies, but no longer decisive ones. And yet, he is not silent. He presses for democratic principles in Eastern Europe. He warns against the dangers of unchecked dominance. He argues not as a commander issuing orders, but as a custodian safeguarding continuity. Sometimes he succeeds. Often, he does not. But even when overruled, he leaves marks, clauses inserted, language tempered, intentions recorded. Influence, in this new world, works through persistence rather than command. Back in Britain, the public continues to see Churchill as the embodiment of victory. His speeches are replayed. His image fills newspapers. The nation associates him with survival itself. Few understand how much has changed behind the scenes. Fewer still grasp that Britain's future standing will depend not on reclaiming authority, but on adapting to its redistribution. Churchill knows this. He reflects often on the paradox of total war, that the alliances required to survive can, by their very success, render older forms of leadership obsolete. He had fought to bring America fully into the war. He had succeeded, and in doing so, he had altered Britain's place in the world forever. When Germany finally collapses in the spring of 1945, celebration erupts across London. Crowds fill the streets. Flags wave from buildings scarred by years of bombing. Relief overtakes exhaustion. Churchill addresses the nation once more. His voice is firm, his tone controlled. He speaks of sacrifice, of unity, of duty fulfilled. He does not speak of loss. Privately, however, he understands that this victory marks an ending as much as a beginning. The British Empire will not return to its pre-war form. The world has become too interconnected, too industrial, too fast-moving for old hierarchies to remain intact. America now stands at the center of Western power. Britain stands beside it, not diminished, but transformed. Churchill accepts this with the realism of a man who has studied history closely enough to recognize its patterns. Power flows toward capacity, influence toward those who can sustain it. His task, now, is to ensure that Britain adapts without fracturing, that it remains relevant not through command, but through contribution. As victory gives way to peace, Churchill turns his attention to what lies ahead with the same seriousness he once reserved for survival. The war has been won. The balance of power has been rewritten. And the consequences of that rewrite will shape the world long after the guns fall silent. Summer 1945, London. After victory, when the guns finally fall silent in Europe, the sound that replaces them is not triumph, but relief. London exhales. Crowds gather beneath scarred facades, flags appearing from windows that had been darkened for years. There is laughter, singing, and the unfamiliar sensation of safety returning without warning sirens. The war in Europe is over. For the nation, it feels like survival rewarded. For Winston Churchill, it feels more complicated. He stands before the country once more, the familiar voice steady, measured, reassuring. He speaks of courage, of endurance, of a people who held when there was nothing left to hold on to. His words carry the weight of shared memory, of nights in shelters, of losses endured without spectacle, of resolve maintained without certainty. The public hears victory. What they do not hear is reflection. In private moments, Churchill understands that the war's end has clarified what the invasion of Normandy first revealed. Britain has emerged victorious, but no longer preeminent. The struggle that defined the century has also redefined its hierarchy. This is not defeat. It is reality. The center of gravity has shifted, not by betrayal, not by failure, but by scale. The world that emerges from the war is governed less by tradition than by capacity, less by rhetoric than by reach. Britain still matters, profoundly, but it will matter differently. Churchill sees it in the post-war negotiations, in the quiet confidence with which American representatives speak of security guarantees, reconstruction plans, global responsibilities. He sees it in the way decisions now form around resources, production, and logistics rather than imperial memory. He has lived long enough and studied deeply enough to recognize the pattern. Power does not vanish. It relocates. Britain's task now is not to reclaim what has passed, but to shape what replaces it. Churchill throws himself into that work with characteristic seriousness. He speaks not of dominance, but of partnership, not of command, but of cooperation. His warnings grow broader, less tied to immediate events and more concerned with the structures being built in their aftermath. He understands that the next catastrophe will not come from aggression alone, but from imbalance, from pride unchecked by restraint. When the electorate removes him from office later that year, the decision stings, but it does not surprise him. The country, exhausted by war, turns toward renewal, toward domestic rebuilding, toward a different kind of future. Churchill steps aside again, not in bitterness, but in recognition. He has played his part. History will remember him for defiance, for speeches, for resolve, for standing when others could not. But there is another legacy, quieter and less often acknowledged. On the night of June 5, 1944, he accepted the limits of political power in a war that had outgrown it. He allowed momentum to take its course. He chose unity over control. That choice did not diminish Britain. It preserved it. The world that followed was not the one he had imagined when the war began. Empires faded. Alliances hardened into institutions. Leadership became collective, conditional, negotiated. But catastrophe was avoided. And peace, however imperfect, became possible. History often remembers war through its battles and its heroes. It remembers speeches delivered under fire, decisions made at the edge of disaster. It remembers courage. Less often does it remember restraint. Yet sometimes, the most consequential act a leader can perform is not to command, but to step aside and allow events to unfold without interference. On the eve of D-Day, that was the choice Britain made, and the world that emerged afterward was shaped by it. History often remembers war through its battles and its heroes. It remembers speeches delivered under fire, decisions made at the edge of catastrophe. Less often does it remember restraint. Yet sometimes, the most consequential act a leader can perform is not to command, but to step aside and allow events to unfold without interference. On the eve of D-Day, that was the choice Britain made, and the world that emerged afterward was shaped by it. If you value World War II history told through restraint rather than spectacle, subscribe for more.